Well, I think most of you know who I am, Christopher Finsk, and I'm going to be brief today in introducing Elie During, Professor During, who is a very important member of the EGS faculty. He is someone who's been with us for years, just doing very gracefully, very strong and interesting work. His background is in philosophy of science, but he's also got a rather extensive, I can say, range in terms of his treatment of aesthetics and metaphysics and philosophy. Elie is constantly bringing these into play with one another. We've had actually some quite fascinating discussions around space, about rhythm, and then he's done also some fairly hardcore teaching on metaphysics in the last couple of years. So he's just a wonderful asset. Elie is one of the top young philosophers of science in France. Um, and as I say, he's also been getting quite involved with aesthetics, or he has been quite involved with aesthetics, but he continues and pushes that further. Um, he's learning piano to give you some idea, and but he also has some very interesting things to say about piano. Glenn Gould in particular, and has recently been contributing to the edition of a text by the journal Critique, which is on philosophy and music, and that should be very interesting. And of course, that will be very interesting for our new initiative in the Institute for Music and Philosophy, which is launching its first meetings, by the way, in the first week of June. If you would like to attend any of that, there will be announcements going up on Instagram, and you can sign up for that. As an auditor, or even you can take a course if you'd like. We're structuring it in terms of courses. They should be the information will be up on Instagram. It should be really interesting. We're off to, I think, a very exciting start. And just for those who will recognize this, we're going to be making violins again. We did this some years ago in Saas-Fee, and I have one over there. It's one of my most precious objects. To have actually put my hand on a violin, it was quite an experience. So we'll be doing that again in Robert Brewer Young's studio. But do look for that for the information on that. It should be a wonderful meeting in the first 2 weeks of June. So Elie, again, I've been wandering a little bit and presenting him. He's at the University of Paris, Nanterre, and again with us for years, and it's just a wonderful colleague, and it's great to have him with us for this presentation. His topic, I'm going to have to slip out quickly. I have other obligations which are kind of overtaking me, but I want to catch at least the first part because I love this title. Make up your own accent, a beginner's guide, and I'm very, very eager to see what he's going to do with that wonderful hook. So, um, with that, let me pass the screen to Elie. We will have he'll talk. We haven't determined how long, but he sort of knows the drill. And then afterwards, we'll have space for discussion. Nemanja will be taking over as host. Nemanja Mitrovic, who, as you know, is very much behind these lectures in every way, and so he will be there as host to facilitate during the discussion. So with that, Elie, let me invite you to begin, and thank you sincerely for doing this with us tonight.
Thank you, Chris. Thank you for the kind words and for introducing me in this manner. Yes, well, I've chosen this topic of the accent, making up one's accent, because it's really a question I've been involved with for the past 15 years, I guess my whole life, but I mean more pointedly the past 15 years. I was invited in 2004 by an artist named Sarkis in Istanbul to give a lecture, and I chose that topic at the time. In a very different context, and I started reflecting on what it means to be European, to develop or acquire many different accents and so the overall the line was political, I guess. And then I started reflecting on this same issue with sociolinguistic, tools and some philosophical references, and I ended up realizing that this question was central in some of my favorite contemporary philosophers, people such as Derrida, Deleuze, and even Jacques Rancière to some extent. And so I try to compose something which I want to present you in a not exactly scattered manner, but you'll see it's punctuated by a series of examples. Some of them are really trivial, others are a bit far-fetched, I'm afraid, and also some subjective remarks regarding my own relation to this question of developing or losing an accent. Um, so I'll start with a fun fact, if you like. A few years ago, the Canadian Journal of Neurological Sciences published a paper describing a very curious syndrome observed in a patient suffering from multiple sclerosis. So one morning, upon waking up, this 52-year-old lady began speaking with what her relatives quickly identified as a foreign accent. In her case, a Dutch accent, the accent of a language that she didn't even speak, okay? That's the fun fact. I don't know if it's not so funny, in fact, but the point is that sometimes later the accent left just as it had come, only to reappear episodically, accompanied by various neurological symptoms. And in fact, this phenomenon is well documented. It's called the foreign accent syndrome. It's one of those weird, neuropathological syndromes. And the paper goes on explaining some of the neurological underpinnings of this condition. In the case I'm reporting, the eruption of the foreign accent, you may call it a fit of accent or maybe an accent seizure, I don't know how to describe it, was definitely linked to certain deep lesions of the white matter in the brain. Some parts of the left parietal lobe and the left frontal lobe were affected as well. And this, of course, explains part of the situation, but only part of it, because there's no real explanation as to why this particular accent was suddenly developed by this person who didn't even speak Dutch, okay? The researchers point out that this condition, the foreign accent syndrome, has been observed after a stroke, a cerebral trauma, or, this is interesting, with no known cause. With no known cause. I love this conclusion. And the conclusion I derive from it is that, well, until proven otherwise, each of us may possibly wake up one morning with a Dutch or a Japanese or French accent, okay? So imagine the turmoil that such a situation would cause. It suggests storylines for science fiction novellas. One morning the population of all Europe wakes up with a Turkish accent, refracted in different ways in each language. Why not? Why not? Okay. So there's something, of course, eerie and really spectral about the eruption of a foreign accent in one's mother tongue. The case I just described is an instance of an unfamiliar language, in fact, an unknown language, coming to haunt one's speech, one elocution, some sort of phonological doppelganger. And of course, other similarly unusual phenomena come to mind, such as glossolalia, speaking in tongues. I would say that to me, this foreign accent syndrome is as mysterious in its own way as the phenomenon of déjà vu or that of phantom limbs. In a somewhat spooky way, it shows that the accent is not just something you have, by virtue of your mother tongue, as an atavism that leaves its imprint on all the other language that you come to acquire. It's not something that you have, that you cherish, or that you try to lose. It's also something that you pick up, that we know, of course, from having spent too much time in a foreign country, for example. But I would say more appropriately, perhaps, based on that particular psychopathological example, that an accent is essentially maybe something that is caught like a disease, something that picks you up, if that makes any sense. The accent can visit you. It can even haunt you for a while. It's something of a revenant in that sense, something that keeps coming back, like maybe a repressed desire, something of that kind. So it's well known in more familiar context that an accent that you thought you'd lost or controlled to a point can come back with a vengeance when you're overcome by emotion, by fear or anger, love or hate. And in some cases, yes, it might be the accent of an immemorial language that you have never spoken. That's the kind of spooky scenario I just described, a kind of phantom phonological memory. And in this respect, if we were to elaborate on this example and kind of put things into perspective from an aesthetic slash psychological perspective, you might say that the phenomenon of phantom accent is comparable to what Aby Warburg described in terms of an anachronistic form of survival. So Warburg used the expression pathos formulas, pathos formen, formulas for pathos or pathetic formulas. He used this expression to describe certain dynamic forms, images, graphics, gestures, sounds even, that bear a particular emotional charge and seem to be the resurgence of very ancient motives. You might say that the accents, with its phonic intensities, its inflections and declivities, and its weird way of recurring, of coming back unexpectedly, is in fact itself woven from such pathos formulas, pathos formen. So the example I have in mind is Warburg was fascinated by the persistence of ancient and even archaic gestural patterns in the speech manners of the people of Naples, Napoli. So certain mimics, certain ways of waving your hands as you speak, he traced back to certain graphic or plastic tropes of Greek and Roman painting and sculpture, and showed that there was a kind of a persistence of those formulas of pathos or pathetic formulas across time. And I would say accents are similarly woven with inflections that are like speech mimics. And similarly, they have their own way of persisting through time, through the languages we use and we learn, and living a life of their own, so to speak. They too can lie dormant for many years before suddenly re-emerging. So this has a lot to do with haunting, for sure, as well as with grafting, to use a more botanical metaphor. The persistence and recurrence of accentual patterns, as they are, attest to a power of intrusion, of insinuation, of something, we call it the accent, for lack of a better word, that occurs between two or more languages. After all, what we commonly describe as a foreign accent is nothing but the insinuation of the tone of one language into another. That could be a kind of a working definition of the accent, understood as foreign accent, the insinuation of the tone of one language into another. So how is this a problem? How does it resonate with political issues is something I want to explain gradually. There are several steps I need to take. And first, I would say this is my first theoretical claim. The phenomenon of accent, based on the examples I just briefly referred to, is in fact twofold. It's immediately presents itself as two-faced. On the one hand, of course, an accent, especially in the case of what we call a foreign accent, the kind I have when I speak to you in what is not my native tongue, what is English, a language I acquired at age 15 or something. The foreign accents typically acts as a marker of origin and belonging. So you can pick up a French accent in certain inflections as I'm speaking, and this traces me back to my origins. So the very notion of accent understood from that perspective brings back the metaphors of roots, of rooting, a land, a culture, a people, and the familiar idea, of course, that our accents in foreign languages comes from our mother tongue, as it's called. It's a family history, very much so. It's a sort of family jewel that is, passed on like a relic that we receive at birth. We can cherish it or hate it, but it's there. It's part of the package, if you like. And of course, in the language of domination, there are more or less respectable families, just as there are nice neighborhoods and slums, right? This is quite easy to identify. And so if we tend to identify accents with linguistic communities and relations of identity and belonging, we are naturally naturally endow it with inherent characteristics. So we may say things like some languages are more musical or sound more musical than others, and the kind of accent that they confer to the speakers that have been raised by this mother tongue, by that mother tongue, is in a way more musical. So Rousseau, the French philosopher, famously distinguished the languages of the North. He described them as northern languages, which he described as deaf, harsh, articulate, shrill, and monotonous. These are very different characterizations, but taken together, they form a kind of a family of languages. And he distinguished them from the languages of the South, which he thought were more lively, more sonorous, more accented, and more eloquent. More accented, and I'm interested in that. Certain languages are inherently more accented. Only the languages of the South, so typically Italian, were in his eyes properly accented or accentuated languages because in his view, they retain something of the musicality of the primitive languages, at least better than other languages. But so this kind of confirms the tendency to ascribe inherent properties to certain languages, which would sort of bear their accents within as inherent characteristics, right? But it's important also to bear in mind that Rousseau added an interesting qualifications when he said that accents, in the sense of musical accentuation, which he was very much interested in, accents in the sense of musical emphasis or accentuations, have been invented because the accents of languages had already been lost. And this, he says, is also true of Italian, or what we perceive as Southern languages. Most of their musicality had already been lost, and that's why we had to compensate for this loss by, over accentuating music in a sense. So the bottom line of this kind of rather convoluted path I'm taking is that maybe we are incapable of dealing with accents properly. Maybe we have a hard time understanding what is at stake there because we have already lost our ear for music. That's one hypothesis. Or maybe the relation runs the opposite way. Well, I'll leave you with these thoughts and turn to another possibility, which is that the problem itself, as I've raised it right now, is in fact moot. Because on the other hand, the accent in many ways appears to be a purely differential phenomenon. I've emphasized the kind of intrinsic nature of the accent, the fact that it's rooted in a linguistic environment that kind of bears inherent marks. But when you think of it, and the notion of a foreign accent already points in that direction, the accent is in fact, you might say inherently, if that makes sense, or essentially, if that makes sense, a differential phenomenon in the sense that in order to understand the way it works, you need to place it in the context of linguistic differences, the differences between languages. So in this perspective, we all produce distinctive accents in the plural, that is basically accentual singularities, in different languages according to the differential relation that exists between certain articulatory or acoustic specificities of certain tongues and dialects that we are familiar with, and other phonological profiles that we perceive in languages that we're less familiar with, that we're trying to learn, or that that are not native tongues. So essentially a differential phenomenon. So these are already two conflicting perspectives on the phenomenon, and this philosophically is itself interesting and requires some work. You know, how can we come up with a consistent view of what the phenomenon, the very phenomenon of having an accent or developing an accent? And then I would, of course, like, based on this initial circumscription of the phenomenon, I'd like to, well, take one step further, one further step, and ask how can we turn this into a matter of individual and possibly political subjectification? So how does reflecting and, in a sense, on our accents and turning our accents into a matter of practice, into an issue, can help us become better subjects of our own languages, if you like, and with a view to the political implications. Of course, and now this is a train of remarks that some of you will find trivial, but we need to rehearse this together. It's very easy to think of the accent in terms of political implications through the prism of so-called identity politics. It's more simply still. The notions of stigmatization, discrimination, that those perceptions that come with the social categorization of certain ways of speaking, of course, immediately brings with it a certain political, connotation, and many examples come to mind where the political implications of having or not having an accent, of disguising an accent or trying to lose it, come to the fore. For example, in France, and I'm sure this is also the case in different countries, telemarketing companies often require their employees based in Africa or Arabic countries, ask them to enroll in drama classes to correct their pronunciation and acquire the good oral skills, and more importantly, a correct French accent. So the very notion of a correct French accent, of course, deserves some comment. There is also the practice, which is very common in France, at least, of systematically subtitling people of so-called ethnic origin in television programs, television news, for example. You'll see that, which many people find offending, because clearly you just have to pay a little more attention if the accent sounds unfamiliar to realize that these people are indeed speaking French, and very correct French for that. And also there's the systematic or quasi-systematic dubbing of Black voices by Black actors to preserve an alleged local color despite the distortions induced by certain transpositions. So, for example, in French, we are systematically overdoing what I guess people perceive as the accent or the speech manners of someone from Black community, for example. So there is a massive, if you like, political issue behind the various practices revolving around the phenomena of accents. And you could say that denaturalizing, decolonizing maybe the voice, the accents, that is detaching it from the most perspicuous features of the individual or collective body as a natural medium of identification, detaching the accents from this, its rooting in these highly charged identities, is of course an important issue. But I would suggest something a little different. I mean, politics is not only made with good feelings. It is in part. I have nothing against good feelings. But I think that for the accent to be effectively constructed as a political question and to be treated as such effectively, not, according to the usual the usual the usual categories. What is truly needed is a scenography of a particular kind. What I have in mind here is a staging, a scenography that enables the accent to reveal, or a certain practice of the accent, a certain way of handling one's accent, and I should use the plural here, one's accents in the different languages or sub-languages, to reveal these accents, to make them audible in a way that brings out the tensions, the gaps between several linguistic identities. I think the accent emerges as a genuine problem when you might say it is detached from the usual familiar categories of identity in order to point to maybe a new uh, maybe truly egalitarian in a sense that will become more apparent later. A new, more egalitarian distribution of speech capacities. I think this is what is at stake in the coexistence of a myriad of accents and changing and fluid and labile accents within the social world. So, in short, the linguistic complexity that is revealed by this coexistence of a myriad of accents can be converted into a vector of political subjectivation once we set the stage for a particular operation, which is to allow the accents to make visible or audible to others, and maybe already to oneself, what was previously neither visible nor audible, namely a singularity, a linguistic singularity that resists identification. That is the opposite of a kind of a ready-made signal or mark, referring you back to an identity, to an origin, to relations of belonging, and so on. Another way to put it, in paraphrasing Rancière, would be that for the accent to be turned into a genuine political operator, it's not enough to simply speak out, and point to a wrong, to protest against a stereotyped identity imposed by a dominant culture, or to claim the right to equal treatment of accents, or the right to universal pidginization or creolization. This is fine, but it's not a political issue. The real problem is to allow the accent to act as and here I'm literally paraphrasing from Rancière, as a claim, the claim of an impossible identity. And for this, we need stages. We need to set up stages where things become visible and audible. So to address this issue and to make it more concrete, I'd like to formulate a central intuition that is guiding me, in fact, here. But I guess it was already apparent in the remarks I've made as a preamble, and I can formulate it negatively this time. The function of accents, the political function of accents in the making of identities or in the reshaping of identities, what I call the vector of subjectivation, is not chiefly the function of a marker of origin or belonging. It may even be the contrary, the opposite. So one way to resist our genealogical impulse in these matters, the impulse to trace back accents to roots, origins, identities, I've already highlighted, I've already emphasized. It is to realize and to, in effect, follow up on the idea that an accent, whether foreign or regional, whether class related or generational, there is such a thing as, the accent of the youth, whether it's idiosyncratic, one person, one individual, or generic, a group of people, we have to realize and follow up on the idea that the accent is neither an inherent property, an inherent trait, nor a stubborn residue bearing witness to our origins, an obscure process of imitation, reinforcement, sedimentation, embodiment, but that it is essentially, as I emphasize, a differential phenomenon. But to begin with, an accent, and this we haven't even highlighted yet, but maybe because it goes without saying, but to begin with, an accent is essentially a secondary quality in the sense Locke or Descartes used the expression, a secondary quality in the sense that it exists only when it is perceived, even faintly. It has no existence in itself, it has no inherent nature. It has no subsistence apart from the way we perceive each other in linguistic context, in linguistic performance. And so in addition, as I've already pointed out, accents mostly exist in the eyes of others in the sense that they are the result of the mutual interference of different linguistic frames and perspectives. So this we should bear in mind. And of course, sociolinguistics confirm this in so many ways. The idea that the accents are really, they only exist, they only become effective at the point of contact and exchange between several different linguistic usages. You might say an accent is the result of the interference between two or more linguistic identities. It's not simply, and maybe it's never, the simple remnants of an origin, a mother tongue or other. And to frame this in an even more forceful way, you could adopt a kind of a structuralist perspective. From a structuralist perspective, you may say that an accent is, in fact, simply a variant of a standard dialect that is itself already accented in different ways, but simply happens to function as the norm in certain contexts. So an accent would only be an inflection or a variation in a spectrum of possibilities, of linguistic possibilities, where certain generic traits are historically deemed as standard, at least in certain contexts, but amidst a myriad of possibilities that effectively take the form of differential relation, moving differential relations between so many variants of a language. So many examples could illustrate this differential or structural distribution of accents in geographical and social space. I will take a very simple illustration of this by referring to a rather lame movie. Alexander is a blockbuster starring Colin Farrell in the lead role. And what I found interesting in that movie, that I've almost entirely forgotten otherwise, is that everyone speaks English, of course. The Greeks speak English, ancient Greek, as we know. But because of the difference between Macedonian accents, the accents of the northern Greeks and the others, well, somehow the producer thought it was a good idea to suggest this difference by hiring Irish and Scottish actors, whose accent, by contrast with the more standard English or American, would sound northern somehow. This is typical. This is a grotesque illustration of the general situation, which I think touches on something real, that our perception of accents is entirely relative and structural. This being said, I would like to add yet another twist. I think that things become really interesting at this point because the evidence that I just recalled from sociolinguistics and structural analysis of speech patterns also suggests something different. Namely that the accent need not concern exclusively foreign languages. I mean, the way our linguistic background or baseline affects the way we speak other languages. So if we take the notion of variant seriously, then we should realize that the accent is in fact a dimension that traverses every language. So an accent is only a vernacular variant of some standard language. You don't even have to compare different languages or different linguistic contexts within the same language, and perhaps within the same linguistic context, different accentual traits will start making sense and coming together and entertaining relations of, oppositional relations, differential relations, because this is the way we do speak. Effectively, we speak by constantly introducing accentual variants within our own language. So before learning foreign languages or being exposed to them and developing accents as the result, we constantly accentuate in different ways the language or the linguistic subvariety that we already speak, whether native language or other, could be the vehicular language that we commonly use, even if we're not a native. The point is that we keep altering it, actively transforming it by insinuating accents all the time for different reasons that partly have to do with this, certain strategies that we develop at an unconscious level to deal with certain social situations. So I know for a fact that I, when I speak French in certain settings, namely when I give a talk or when I'm in class in front of a big, in a big room, I tend to have a rather high-pitched voice, even higher than what you hear now. And this sounds somehow like a character from a movie shot in the 50s. I know that. Why is it the case? I'm not sure. Maybe because I like that kind of movies because I've watched them a lot. Maybe it's just the natural tension that raises my voice. But the accent itself, I'm not sure where it comes from. I'm sure it's a way to cope with the situation on some level. Not sure how. And so this sociolinguists are interested in the kind of ongoing performance by which we use speech acts and insinuate accentual patterns as adaptive strategy in the social world. There's a very famous example by Labov, the sociolinguist Labov, which illustrates what is sometimes called code switching capacity we have as speakers to switch very rapidly or to oscillate between different linguistic codes, which may be different varieties of accents within the same language. And so, for example, there's a famous analysis that was carried out with the populations from Martha's Vineyard. So the idea was that the inhabitants of the island sort of consciously, in fact, or quasi-consciously modified their pronunciation of English to simply distinguish themselves from the invading tourists from Boston. This is an interesting fact. And it shows that we can think of the accent not as a set differential relation between two languages, but as a moving, changing, ongoing transformation of one single language into its subvarieties, linguistic subvarieties according to different contexts and performative contexts. Yes. So let me move on because it's already getting late and I haven't really touched on the more philosophical stuff that I wanted to introduce, but I thought it necessary to actually come back to the kind of natural phenomenon of the accent or the accents in the plural, the way we relate to them at a quasi unconscious level, and the necessity of actually setting the stage for a more reflective and maybe more active relation to our various accents, with the possibility of turning this into a political issue. So Um, I guess I can skip one example. You'll probably all have it in mind if you've seen Inglorious Bastards, Tarantino's movies, Quentin Tarantino's movies, where there's a famous scene. It's not only famous because it's because of its sheer virtuosity, because it's very long too, but more importantly, the entire conversations takes place in German. You know, from beginning to end, people are in a cellar, in a Windstube, as it is during the Second World War, and then they're all dressed up as Wehrmacht officers, and a group of resistance fighters and some people from the American Special Ops are also disguised as Germans, and they pretend to be Germans, and so they counterfeit quite well, I have to say, German the German tongue. And it gets to a point, well, it ends up in a horrific massacre, as often with Tarantino. But the reason why this ends up rather badly is that one of the characters has such an impeccable German delivery in German, that another officer, an actual Nazi, spots him as someone from abroad because he doesn't have any accent. Now, the paradox is that he's spotted, he raises suspicions because because of his excessive counterfeiting of German language, a de-accented pronunciation that immediately gives away his game, and this is because of precisely because of the sheer oddity of someone who has blended with its environment so perfectly that there's no interval, no gap, no differential relation available for people to locate him. So he's immediately identified as someone entirely foreign, despite his having, in a way, the most impeccable accent. It's the absence of an actual accent in German that makes him that gives him away. Okay, what is the lesson from this? I'll leave it to you. But it's another of these paradoxes that I think are interesting to bear in mind, to realize how elusive the very phenomenon of the accent is. Okay, so you could have an accent as a result of not having one, because the way you speak has been de-accented to a point where it becomes bland and artificial. Okay, let me now move on to the philosophical material that I think at this point is interesting to bring in. So what we're trying to take our lead from this differential structuralist approach to accentual phenomena, the notion that we really have accents only for others, but that this proposition can be turned against itself, to realize that we already have an accent, and probably many accents, within our own language, right? So we can come to that level of realization because we've adopted the differentialist or structuralist approach to the accent. We realize that the same framework can be applied within one's language. And so the question becomes, of course, isn't it all about the way we appropriate our own linguistic framework to turn it into our own, and to develop our own way of speaking, whatever your native tongue is? It's not about being fed by a mother tongue. It's about tapping into the potentials of your own language to insinuate your personal accent in relation to the many different usage of your language, and also, of course, by way of consequence, in relation to other languages that you may want to learn or speak, or be exposed to in some way or other. So beyond the linguistic stereotypes that we've also touched upon, beyond the codification of different types of accents corresponding to different types of, contexts or identities. I think the main lesson to be taken from sociolinguistics and the structural approach to spoken language is that accentual phenomena are very elusive and labile and in a state of constant transformation. And that it's really a miracle that we, linguistic performers, can appropriate a language and insinuate our own accents to develop a voice, a singular, a personal voice. So the process is very much one of hybridization, as Bakhtin and Labov emphasize in different ways. There's a plastic and fluid usage of language, which allows for this stylistic variability in the way we appropriate locutions and perform them orally with a style of our own. Endowing them with a kind of phonological profile of our own. So you could, by analogy with the word idiolect, which kind of designates the horizon of this process of continuous production of linguistic forms, linguistic novelty, we say idiolect, which would be, at the limit, a language spoken only by one person, by one singular individual. By analogy, you could speak of idiophony. An idiophonic practice would be a way of appropriating your own language and developing an accent, or as it is, a spectrum of accents in a singular way in your own language. You like an idiophonic fraying of your language. My hypothesis is that in order for this to be effective as a political proposition, which I think it is ultimately, we need to set up a scene where the effects of producing an accent, of producing it publicly for others in public contexts, become perceivable or audible, as it is. So what would be the concept of a scene that we need here? I've referred to cinema. I will refer very soon, if I have time, to examples taken from literature. But the general concept of a scene I take, in fact, from Jacques Rancière. I would say, following him, that a stage is a context where a linguistic performance, as it is, can significantly disrupt the division of places that is governed by a dominant use of language. So it's a way of performing a speech act, if you like, where that disturbs or possibly disrupts the usual division of places. And by places here, I mean the way you're categorized and identified as a speaker in relation to different linguistic skills or levels of competence and degrees of relevance of certain speech acts to certain situations and so on. So this is rather abstract, I'm afraid, but the point again is that a scene doesn't need to be an actual stage, right? It can be a fictional form which, again, dramatizes and makes visible and audible the disruptive potential of harboring, of bearing, I don't know what's the appropriate word, of producing an accent publicly and making it heard. So in this regard, it is important to take into account the representation of accents in literature, theater, film, and to some extent philosophy. These are all scenes or stages, fictional stages, where this question can be addressed using toy models, if you like, fictional constructs, fictional worlds, where the question can be addressed and focused on before we even implement it in experimental fields in actual social life, right? And here, very quickly, my concluding remarks, as they are, because I can we're almost reaching the end of my my talk, of my time, that is, a few punctuations from literature and philosophy that would, I hope, will give you a sense of how we could start working on the staging of accents and then the kind of politicization of these issues from the perspective of both, well, let's say literature and philosophy. I'll leave aside cinema. The few examples I gave are not entirely convincing in terms of their political implications, but I have in mind, I'll just mention it for lack of time, I have in mind the cinema of Robert Bresson. I mentioned those films shot in the 50s. Well, Bresson, I'm a great admirer of his work, had the habit of directing his actors, his cinematographic figures, as he liked to call them, figures, um, um, uh, in a certain way. He forced them, in fact, to develop a very, very peculiar way of articulating, the script, the phrases, a way that amounted to a radical, you might say, a radical de-accentuation of the usual of the usual language, of the dominant way things are said. These accentuations resulted in this white or bland or flat monochord voice that you'll see in films like Pickpocket or others. Very peculiar, not at all the kind of accent from the typical 50s movies. It's something entirely singular, in a way impersonal, which allows, strangely enough, allows very strong affective intensities to be produced. So it's a de-accentuation that is the condition for a re-intensification of speech in a way that is only possible, I think, through the medium of cinema. It would never work on a stage, on an actual theater stage. And for reasons that I need not develop here, of course, Bresson was very critical of the notion that cinema was filmed theater. He thought it was something entirely different, something different entirely, and that is what allowed him to actually carry out this work of de-accentuation of the French, which I find so fascinating. So to turn back to a more classical, maybe easier example, I would refer you to a famous passage from Proust in The Search for Lost Time, La Recherche du Temps Perdu. There's a famous figure, the writer named Bergotte, okay, who Proust explains is singularized by the insinuating charm of his voice, his unique accent. That is one of his defining characteristics. He has this way of speaking. And generally speaking, Proust makes constant reference to the characters' voices and their elocutionary peculiarities. He has an obsession with accents as a writer. And of course, this tells us something already about, the tone that the author, Proust himself, conveys in his writing. His obsession with accents, in fact, is a metaphor of style. And in Bergotte's case, in the case of this writer, which is one of the characters of his book, Proust explains to us that some of the peculiarities of his elocution are the result of a mother tongue, or more specifically, a linguistic family heritage that is quite unique. He also adds that what Bergotte achieved was getting rid of his accent progressively. I mean, in his old age, he doesn't speak the same way as when he was 30. And the way this is achieved is by inventing another accent, which is the style or the tone of Bergotte as a writer. So his literary accent, if you like. And this, of course, is again a metaphor of what is going on in Proust's own novel, which is a way to move from the chronic of superficial mundanity to the exploration of the recesses of consciousness, the inventing of a style that doesn't require changing the subject, but altering one's tone and finding an accent in describing the very same things, which brings us to an entirely new dimension. So the point again, to use a famous formula, one of Proust's famous formula is to develop a foreign language in writing one's language. So in the case of Proust, writing French in a way that sounds like a foreign language and that in fact resembles nothing that is not traceable to a kind of a family or lineage or a kind of idiosyncratic origin, something which is almost entirely a creation. And this transposition, if you like, from a kind of idiosyncratic accent, effective accent, to a style, to a literary style, is paralleled in Proust's writing and in Bergot's writing. We don't know much about his writing because there's no quote from Bergot, the character, but this is the way Proust describes what is going on. I quote, this is a long passage, but I think it deserves to be quoted in full because it captures so many aspects of, I think, what is at stake here. The special way Proust writes, a little too meticulous, too intense, that he, Bergot, had of pronouncing certain words, certain adjectives, which constantly recurred in his conversation, and which he never uttered without a certain emphasis, giving to each of their syllables a separate force, and intoning the last, as for instance the word visage, which he always used in preference to figure, and enriched with a number of superfluous V's and S's and G's, which seemed all to explode from his outstretched palm at such moments. All this, Proust writes, corresponded exactly to the fine passages where in his prose he brought out those favorite words, preceded by a sort of pause, and composed in such a way in the metrical whole of the sentence that the reader was obliged, if he was not to make a false quantity, to give to each of them its full value. So it's a kind of a musical composition that derives something of the original spoken accent, but transposes it in writing. And Proust adds this important passage. He says, and yet one did not find in Bergot's speech a certain luminosity which in his books, as in those of some other writers, often modified in the written sentence the appearance of his words. This was doubtless because that light issues from so profound a depth that its rays do not penetrate to our spoken words in the hours in which, thrown open to others by the act of conversation, we are to a certain extent closed to ourselves. In this respect, there was more modulation, more stress, I would say more accent, in his books than in his talk. Stress independent of beauty of style, which the author himself has possibly not perceived, since it's not separable from his most intimate personality. So here there's the notion that you don't quite hear your own accent. You don't quite realize the accent that you have, but people do, your readers. It was this stress which, at the moments when in his books Bergot was entirely natural, gave a rhythm to the words, often at such times quite insignificant, that he wrote. Certain peculiarities of elocution, faint traces of which were to be found in Bergot's conversation, were not exclusively his own. There was something abrupt and harsh in the closing words of a cheerful sentence, something faint and dying at the end of a sad one, etc. And now he's referring back to his conversation, the way he spoke, the way it kind of echoed the way his family spoke, his siblings. But ultimately, what happens in his case is that he managed to transpose and perpetuate in his prose the weird, strange manner he had of dwelling on words. And by achieving this, what happened is that in his late days, his conversation was less intriguing, less singular than it used to be, as if his speech had been disorchestrated, Hus writes, as a result of being transposed into written prose. I quote, "From the day on which he had begun to write, his voice had abandoned this orchestration forever." So the stage here, the literary stage, is one which allows the alchemic process of transposing one's idiosyncratic but partly communal accent, one inherited from a background, a family, a history, a lineage, transposing it to a literary style, and as a result, losing the accent of your speech, of your conversation, in favor of something else altogether, which is a tone, the tone of a writer, one that the writer himself doesn't quite realize or doesn't quite hear as other would. I will end with the last two philosophical punctuations that I had in mind, namely Derrida and Deleuze. These are quite famous texts, so I don't think I need to rehearse them with you. That would be, I think, something we could do in a seminar or in a class format. For a lecture, I can be more elliptic or allusive and point you to those texts. The first, by Derrida, is called The Monolingualism of the Other. Le monolinguisme de l'autre, the monolingualism of the other. And you might say it amounts to a radical deconstruction of the notion of what is proper, what is the inherent property of language, or of the accent as it is here. Deleuze, on the other hand, praises a form of polylinguism, multilingualism. He celebrates the heterogeneous multiplicity of becomings that is internal to language itself. Pretty much along the lines of the sociolinguist that I quoted, he uses them with Guattari in 1,000 Plateaus, and also already in the book on Kafka, the book on minor literature, as they call it, the book on Kafka. They use extensively, they refer to sociolinguistic to highlight the fact that any language, any linguistic performance is animated by an endless process of becoming other. And as a result, every language opens up to a multiplicity of other languages that are folded within any language, including the dominant language. So in Kafka's case, German, but spoken and, more importantly, written with a Yiddish accent by someone living in Prague. So Derrida's thesis on monolingualism can be summed up in one basic axiom, or you might say it's the premise on which everything is constructed. He writes, let me pull out the exact quote here. I don't want to misquote. Yeah, the axiom of the monolingual, it's quite simple. It comes in the form of a performative contradiction. I only have one language, it's not mine. I only have one language, it's not mine. What is the language here? Obviously, it's French. I mean, Derrida's native tongue is French. It's not Yiddish, it's not Arabic. But of course, it's very important for him that the relation being, as he describes himself, un Français d'Algérie, or sometimes a Franco-Maghrébin, which means Franco-Arabic in some sense. He was born in Algeria before the war, okay? He can only define his relation to French language, his so-called mother tongue, in terms of a tensed differential relation with Arabic, okay? And part of the issue of the monolingual comes from the fact that his master tongue, his mother tongue, is haunted by another language that he doesn't speak, okay? So that partly explains the meaning of the basic axiom. I only have one language, it's not mine. So there's a kind of original disappropriation, by virtue of which Derrida finds himself robbed from the mother tongue in the usual sense. It's not a place, a comfortable place in which you could install yourself, a kind of linguistic backdrop or baseline from which you could, you could um, find your impulsion, your basic impulsion. It's more of a dead end or locked place that is only accessible in the form of a contradiction. Um, the master tongue is wrapped in an aura of institutional authority. It's the French that you need to acquire in the proper way, but it's also a lost language, very much a lost language, a cryptic, almost an assimilable language that the Franco-Algerian, Derrida, will never fully acquire. And this is where I want to come to, what I want to come to. This becomes apparent in the way Derrida handled, more or less successfully, his own relation to what is commonly called a pied noir accent. Pied noir is, or black feet, literally, is the way we describe the French population, Jewish or non-Jewish, that lived in Algeria, as a result of colonization. And you may have heard about the tragedy associated with, well, both colonization and then the kind of departure from this population and the very difficult times they had reincorporating the métropole, namely the fatherland, if you like. So it was not easy, and Derrida was very much conscious of having a very strong accent, kind of tracing him back to that population. The additional factor, which is Jewish identity in his case, of course, makes things even more complex. But the bottom line is that in a very striking passage in the middle of the book, Monolingualism of the Other, there is a very subjective first-person description of the way he handles or tries to control, as it is, his own accent. And this is how it goes. This, I guess, will be my last quote, because Deleuze, in a way, is something that is probably more well-known. I quote from Monolingualism of the Other. I do not believe, Derrida writes, that anyone can detect by reading, if I do not myself declare it, that I am a French Algerian. And I can, as a French native, I can attest to the fact that there's no trace of foreignness or foreign origin in Derrida's writing, although it's very peculiar and it has an accent of its own. There's no identity that is clearly attached to it in the sense of, being a French Algerian. Derrida goes on, I retain no doubt a sort of acquired reflex from the necessity of this vigilant transformation. I'm not proud of it. I make no doctrine of it, but so it is. An accent, any French accent, but above all, a strong Southern accent, seems incompatible to me with the intellectual dignity of public speech. In parentheses, you read, inadmissible, isn't it? Well, I admit it. And then he goes on, incompatible a fortiori with the vocation of a poetic speech. For example, when I heard René Char, famous French poet, read his sententious aphorism with an accent that struck me as at once comical and obscene, as the betrayal of a truth, it ruined in no small measure an admiration of my youth. This is very honest and very harsh, but this is the way he perceived others' accents. And now he turns to himself. And this is what he writes. I have never seen, and this is a scene, this is a subjective staging of the accent, the kind of performative staging that I have in mind and that I think should act as templates for reflecting in a broader way on the political implications of the coexistence of so many accents within our communities and within ourselves as subjects. This is what he writes about his experience, his lived experience of his own accent. I have never ceased learning, especially when teaching, to speak softly, a difficult task for a pied noir, and especially from within my family. So they have a reputation for being extroverted and somewhat loud. That's what he's referring to. And the challenge, he writes, is to ensure that this soft spokenness reveal the reserves of what is thus held in reserve with difficulty and with great difficulty, contained by the Ludgate, a precarious Ludgate. I guess this is a dam, right? That allows one to apprehend the catastrophe. The worst can happen at every turn. So in a rather cryptic way, he's referring to the fact that he's holding back an accent all the time, especially when he's performing a seminar. When he's engaging in public speech, he's making sure that everything is sort of in control, with the vivid realization that at any time the worst can happen. The dam can break and the accent can come back with a vengeance, hit back with a vengeance. It's always threatening to give way. He adds, I was the first to be afraid of my own voice, as if it were not my own, and to challenge it, even to hate it. I was the first to be afraid of my own voice, as if it were not mine, and to contest it, even to detest it. But the point I want to underline, and I will end on this rather painful scene, painful stage that, in fact, that Derrida has reenacted in his whole life. I want to highlight the passage that I just read, where he says that he ensures, I quote, that this soft spokenness, which of course is meant to control the underlying accent and to keep it in reserve, that this soft spokenness reveal, I quote, the reserve of what is thus held in reserve. So you want to reveal the reserve of what is thus held in reserve. And this paradox, which he slides upon, he doesn't, insist, he doesn't really explain it. He doesn't come back to this. The necessity of revealing the reserve of what is held in reserve, of revealing maybe the fact that you are in control, is what eventually gives Derrida, I mean, the mature Derrida, not the young Derrida that moves to Paris at age 18 and experiences the suffering of being this, this ex-Elie and ridiculed for his strange accent. The mature Derrida, Derrida who developed this art of controlling his own accent, is haunted by it, very much so, but also managed to develop, of course, in writing, according to a series of transpositions that maybe have their equivalent in Proust, right? But already in his speech, in his spoken manners, what he did is to manage to develop an accent, you might say an accent to the second power, an accent built upon an accent, and resulting from the constant act of controlling the accent beneath, but doing so in a way that reveals the fact that you're controlling, that reveals the fact that something is being held in reserve. And this play, this interesting play on the limit, on the verge of the catastrophe, which would be, the moment, and this happens with Derrida, and he also acknowledges that when he's under strong emotional stress, the original accent will come out, and the worst can happen then, because he becomes ashamed of himself. He becomes hyper-conscious of the way people actually perceive him speaking, and so on and so forth. But nevertheless, the whole point is not to suppress and to delete an accent which in any way cannot be suppressed. And that makes it truly inappropriable. It's your own, but you're not in control. It very much controls you. It's not a matter of suppressing what is not suppressible. It's a matter of holding it in reserve and building building up a secondary accent, an accent to the second power, as an accent of an accent, if you like, by revealing in subtle manners, in a subtle manner, the fact that you're holding something in reserve. So that the original accent sort of transpires through your speech in a way that also introduces a risk, an element of uncertainty and lack of control, if you like. This is how, on the shores of language, here French language, neither inside nor outside of it, you can develop an accent of your own. So Deleuze would be, and I will end on these words, Deleuze would be an alternative to this. The issue, according to Deleuze, is not so much to play with the accent that you have inherited from, not from a mother tongue, but from the inappropriable language which is yours, but that cannot be appropriated, the one that you inherit, but that cannot be yours properly speaking. Is not so much to come to terms with this situation as to open up to the plurality of accents that already traverse your own language. So the point is to carry the language itself, your language, along its lines of intensification and to achieve what he describes as breadth of pure intensity that mark limits of language. So one guiding metaphor that he uses to convey this idea is the metaphor of stuttering. Gives different examples in Faulkner, in Céline, in Joyce, in Melville. The fact that a character who stutters, of course, who stutters in speech is something, but then a writer who becomes a stutterer in language is another. It's a matter of making the language itself stutter. And by stuttering here, he means allowing effective and intensive lines to traverse, to cross language and bring it to its own intensive limits. So the idea literally is to develop not one, but several accents, which are almost entirely new, almost entirely created, by allowing language to fold upon itself and to proliferate along its own lines of becoming. So we're left with this alternative, in a sense, either the monolingualism of the other or what Deleuze describes as a minor use of language. So introducing strange accents or inflections within the dominant language, German in Kafka's case. The alternative is between a thwarted accent, Derrida, or a stammer, a stuttering of language, Deleuze. But I would say that between these two possibilities, we should be careful not to decide too quickly. That what is even more important, I think, is to realize that these are two options, two directions that one may take on the condition that the stage of the accent has been opened up, has been set up. In both cases, Derrida and Deleuze, clearly the stage, the guiding idea is that ultimately the stage of the accent is writing, whether it's literature or philosophy or an ongoing hermeneutics of literature in Derrida's case. The true stage is not the spoken medium, the medium of spoken language, but the literature. There may be alternatives to this. And here, of course, I have in mind the work of Jacques Rancière, especially in the book called Proletarian Nights, where he was actually interested not only in the writing, the literary experiments carried out by workers as a political gesture, but also in the way this affected in return the way they could, pretend to make themselves literally heard in public settings. So the way speech could be appropriated not only through the medium of writing, poetry, or literature, but also in certain stages that included, well, political meetings and the circulation of certain mots d'ordre or political slogans, as they are. This implies, according to Rancière, and that would be a third possibility, my last words, I quote, a process of disidentification, of tearing oneself away from any identity, including working class identity, of entering by effraction into the terrain of the thought and speech of others, entering by effraction. So think of developing an accent or experimenting with accents as entering by effraction, it's a very transgressive gesture, into the field and possibly the thought and speech of others. I will end on this notion of the accent as an operator of direct disidentification, and leave you with these propositions, and maybe with we have time, with possibility of asking a few questions or suggesting, other extensions or possible alternatives that I haven't even mentioned yet. Nemanja, you want to take things from there?
Thank you, Elie. Thank you, everyone who attended. I'm looking forward to your seminar on the Sublime in the summer.
Right. Yep.
So
that's next summer.
Looking forward to that, and thank you for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Thank everyone who attended.
Have a good day. Bye.
Thank you.
Bye.
Good night.